Philip, what do you call a adequately organized worker-owned factory?
Base as hell.
A satisfactory.
Uh, that
So,
that pun seems so obvious in retrospect, and yet I suppose
so,
that's what makes a dad joke is that like you feel at the end of it. I really should have guessed that, but didn't.
so welcome to Raise 'em Left, a podcast about parenting from a leftist perspective and lens. This is part two, so if you're listening to it right now and you haven't listened to part one, this is going to be weird and confusing, and you should go listen to part one. And so last week we discussed. Oh, I got to think all the way back to last week. What was it that we talked about? Latchkey parenting. And now this week we're going to talk about helicopter parenting.
The Oscar goes to you, by the way. I'm sure they can't tell by our clothes that no time has passed for us when a week has passed for them. But still,
To be fair, right now it is completely reasonable for me to be wearing the same set of clothes for multiple days in a row,
yeah.
and
I
to
suppose
not.
mine's just red from they can't see like the writing on it. It's like a little but
Yeah, the writing that says "cast off your chains, the time is now."
oh, I wish it was so cool. It just has the quote from that old SNL skit Deep Thoughts that says, before you criticize someone, you should walk a mile in your shoes. That way when you criticize them, you're a mile away and you have their shoes.
so, um, yeah. So this week, so as I said, we're talking about helicopter parenting. So like last week, let's dive into what it is. Um, there was one of these that, and not to call you out completely, but there was one of these that you said at one point, I think in a group chat we were in, that you hadn't heard of.
Um, Between latchkey, oh, I hadn't heard of latchkey parenting when you first used the term.
Hmm.
I mean, I guess I was vaguely familiar with the idea of like some kids like are home alone without parents sometimes, like even when they're young. Like I kind of knew that that was a thing that some people did, but I never had heard the term latchkey parenting to describe it.
Hmm. It's interesting to me because it's just like a thing that I've had like bragged to me so many times. Like I was a latchkey parent. I was from the tough generation that had to learn how to raise ourselves, and I was just always like, that's toxic as shit. But okay, but
Interesting.
it's like I wish I was as lucky as you, and I hadn't heard of it. But
Yeah,
I'm
I mean,
guessing.
helicopter parenting is definitely something I've heard about. Like that was, I feel like, all over my childhood, like discourse about helicopter parenting and like that it was bad or people saying like trying to defend it or whatever.
Yeah, so this is, and I find that interesting, and that was kind of why I was inquiring because this is something I think is interesting about these two, and that helicopter parenting um, is relatively newer, not quite as parsed out. Like there's studies on latchkey parenting, and there really isn't quite as much on helicopter parenting. This is one that I hadn't heard of actually until I was in college, and when I was in college, I heard of it through friends of mine who were teachers and who were dealing with a bunch of helicopter parents who in college were like, you know, hovering over their college students in aggressive and frustrating ways for teachers and professors. So the definition is a parent who is extremely involved, controlling, and attentive to a child's experiences and issues, specifically, in my experience at least, within educational institutions. So in some ways, we see that I see in like some of the things. This is one where you might call me a little wrong in some of my assertions here because again, it's not being pulled so much from like hard studies as it is from like general vibes from the internet. And so I see a lot of things in writing of this in like ways that like opinion pieces have been written about it. They kind of sees it as like a reaction to latchkey parenting by folks who were latchkey parented. Is like, okay, well, I'm going to take that
Hmm.
opposite route from this thing that I was born or I was raised into. Um, the initial metaphor we see come up in 1969 in Between Parent and Teenager by Dr. Haim Gino. me and pronunciations will never be good. But it didn't really become popular until the late 1980s and gained more notoriety into the 2000s as academic institutions started noticing things such as parents calling students in college to wake them up in the morning, or showing up to co-attended college functions and class meetings. So, like, I had a really weird experience with this, in my opinion, where when I was getting ready for my study abroad, I was invited to an orientation meeting that I showed up to. So it was like everybody who was going to China went to this big orientation meeting to where we were going to learn like basic things about how our time in China was going to be. And when I showed up, everybody's parents were with them. And this was a thing that the school had planned on. And I was just awkwardly there by myself. And people were like, where's your parents? And I'm like, well, they're not here. I'm 22. I don't bring my parents to things, to meetings. And then like people were like treating me like an orphan, like, "Oh, I'm so sorry they didn't make it." And it's like, "What? No, they didn't I didn't invite them. I'm an adult." And so yeah. So you know this kind of crops up like really heavily in educational institutions. But we also do see this stretch out across other social institutions. This is kind of associated with the expansion and growth of preschool programs, and then preschool programs, and after school programs, and then after school programs. Like being in the Parks and Rec field, this is a place where I see this happen really, still really aggressively, even though in some of this is kind of fallen out of favor. But I feel like it cropped up with my generation of a lot of parents who thought that just every single moment of a child's time should be structured. So you wake up in the morning and you immediately go into a program. You know, the idea that you would have like a few hours to yourself after school is just kind of absurd. It's like, no, you have to be in a sport, in like a dance class, in a XYZ, something that is structured. And I've ran into this a lot in, you know, in like programming for Parks and Rec programs, not in current place that I'm at, but in my previous employment, where I, you know, by nature of my experience working with kids, I want to give them a considerable amount of free time to be expressive and creative and do some of their own stuff. And this was like seen as just absurd by my administration. My administration was like, "What? No, you can't have unplanned time in your day. Every moment needs to be structured with something they are explicitly doing." And I'm like, "What? That's not how kids work. That's absurd. Why would you do that?" And that kind of folds into this. This is kind of where some of that's coming from. Um, and so you know we also see that tied to like predilections of athletics, gifted programs, you know, kind of finding anything that they excel at rather than something they enjoy and engage with freely. And there's these perceived benefits that come along with it. Creating carefully curated childhoods makes them kind of free of the possibility of anything bad happening, right? um, there's this idea that if your kids are always in a program, they're not going to be out on the streets. They're not going to be out getting in trouble. They're not going to be, you know, hanging out with other kids their same age, learning bad things. They're not going to be having sex. They're not going to be doing drugs. Um, but that doesn't really play out, and I'll get to that in the documented effects here. But other positive effects is this idea of like building a foundation for a successful future, building a structured lifestyle so that going forward in their life they'll have these very structured goals, very structured life that they'll just continue living as this like very well-oiled machine for productivity. And that's really, in my opinion, what all of this is about, is like maximizing productivity. It's this thing that we kind of self-tell ourselves of like, oh, we have to be productive all the time, and it's instilling that into a kid.
And this is where I find your, you know, to harken back to something we were discussing at the beginning of part one, where I find your analogy to neoliberalism particularly compelling, because neoliberalism very much has this central narrative by which, you know, like that when things go wrong, there's never a question about the centrality, the central correctness of that narrative. It's very similar to the justifications of some of the conservative stuff we were talking about, uh, that conservatives have certain narratives about, you know, ways of enacting certain things that seemed like ordained by nature. I would say that like there's this other view that's like, no, it's not it's stuff isn't ordained by nature. There's no God telling you how things should be. We figured it out. We figured out the best way for things to be. And here's the pattern that identifies a successful life. And it's kids go to school, they get good grades, they graduate, valedictorian, they go to a good college, they get a degree, and they get a high paying job in some field that requires that college degree, right? Like there's this like thing, and any failures along that route, any ways in which that doesn't like work in a particular situation, is usually like, oh, you just gotta, either find the right program to get people, onto that track from where they veered off of it or anything. It's like any deviation is immediately met with like, hold on, move back over here, get back on the path, do the thing. And it's never seen as like, maybe we should allow deviations. Maybe like there's not only one or two ways to do, to have a good life. Um, and so I see that very similarly, here. It's like that, oh, we need to have a good structured life, lots of activities to enrich it, to expand your thing, to do this thing, activity, fill it up. And so like you never have a chance to veer off the path. And um, so that you eventually arrive at, success. Of course, the fundamental question that both at the economic level with neoliberalism and the parenting level with, you know, helicopter parenting is that success worthwhile? Is that success something we should strive for? Is it good? Now, I am sympathetic to the group of people who might say like, well, it's important to teach your children how to succeed in the current society that they exist in because they need to be able to survive. And sure, like I don't have any problem at the end of the day with like extracurricular activities or gifted intelligent program or like, STEM club or whatever is supposed to, does in some way play into capitalism. I'm not like, I don't essentialize like anything that remotely helps capitalism as inherently bad, but like there it's important to be making that distinction while in the background questioning like, is this something that how much should I push this, right? Like it's you don't see it as, what you shouldn't see it as is like, this is the correct path. I need my kid to be on this path in order to have them arrive at success with a capital S, TM defined, uh, you know, correctly by society. But you do need to give them a set of tools and like give them some sort of sense of like, hey, if you're going to go off in this direction, just know that's going to make these things harder and you're going to have to compensate for that, because if you don't compensate for that, you're going to get crushed or whatever. So like, you know I feel like I heard this a lot as a kid when it came to like careers that were not in STEM in particular. It was like, well, you couldn't go, like there was a lot of like, you shouldn't be a musician, you shouldn't be an artist, you shouldn't be like these things because that's bad. There's no living to be made there. You need to go into STEM, you need to get a real job, uh, filling out paperwork in some place or whatever, like there. Um, Whereas I think like, instead of saying like, that's not a career, instead say like, hey, you want to be YouTuber, okay, that's a very saturated thing, it's very competitive, and it requires a lot of front loading of work and effort. And if you're gonna like go off and do that, and then you want to make that your like legit career, you got to be prepared for all the difficulty that comes with that. And you better be evaluating that cost. But instead it often gets framed as like, that's just not a real job.
Yeah, no, 100%. And it's and that's one of the things about like that in particular. Like I went through all of that too. And it's of course a concern, like, and a thought I have with raising my own son, is that of course I want him to be of of revolutionary mind, right? I want him to understand the problems of capitalism. I want him to take a part in the dismantling of capitalism and patriarchy and all of these things. but I also want him to be able to function and have a roof over his head and have security and have, you know, the privileges that I enjoy and maybe a few more. Um, so yeah, I want him to be able to function within capitalism in the same way that I have to function in capitalism, but also to
Sure.
have the freedom to do that in a way that doesn't crush him as a human being and allows him to maybe help dismantle the whole thing. This idea of revolutionary is a multi generational project. Yeah, and I mean, there's ways to do like some of that, have those discussions while into well, the thing here that I think is interesting is we talk about, well, you can't encourage those things and prepare them well for surviving in a system of capitalism, except that this is very similar, right? To, well, if you teach kids about sex ed, then they're just going to have more sex. And no, what ends up happening is they're going to do it anyways, but they're going to be less prepared for it. And then they're going to run into problems like STDs and teen pregnancies and such and so forth. Your kid wants to be a YouTuber. You tell them, no, that's not a real job. Go get a real job, like a good, honest, tax paying American capitalist worker. They're just going to go be a YouTuber anyway, but they're not going to understand the capitalistic realities that exist around the framework of that job, and they're not going to be able to do it successfully if they were ever going to be able to do it successfully at all. They're just not going to be best prepared to be successful at that. Because that thing is a job. That is a very real job, a hard job, and a difficult job to get into, but it's a real job. I went through that with, with a music career and with, my degree was originally in media production. And yeah, I went through a lot of that. My parents were thankfully extremely supportive and very open about like, well, here's some of these difficulties that are going to exist in that career that you want to get into. But you know what? There's difficulties in every career. Fuck
Yeah.
it. Go ham.
It,
If you want to
what's
do it, do it.
what's really fascinating to me is that there's a particular area in which like this like cautious get a real job type of narrative completely disappears around sports.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone is just like completely has this like just massive fantasy in their head of sports like like that's how you like that's the lottery thing that everyone's like yeah let's do that like there's like people have
Yep.
this thing of like I mean colleges god I mean like locally here in Norman Oklahoma the like we joke that there are two religions in primary religions in Oklahoma and the biggest one is OU football and the second one is Christianity and the amount of money that goes into that and there are all kinds of like arguments and discourse about like oh well it pays for itself like maybe it's not really but like the the whole atmosphere of like college football and college basketball and like the the high schools that feed into that and the recruitments that go into like curating the people that go into that system that eventually feeds into the NFL and the NBA and all that stuff like there's so much money and time spent public dollars spent on curating this fantasy of like becoming a professional sports athlete that that kids get pushed into super hard with absolutely no regard for the challenges and 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 whatnot that plays into that and that frustrates me deeply.
Yeah. No, 100%. And that's, I mean, I think, yeah, working in parks and recreation, I saw that so often. It was actually really deeply infuriating because specifically working in poor working class communities, I would always run into this. Like, kids would come into the gym and be like, hey, so what do you want to do after high school? And like 10 kids and nine of them would say, oh, I'm going to be in the NBA. Like, all right, guys, like, plan B. What's plan B? And I mean, like, and this isn't me saying, oh no, you shouldn't do that. No, fuck it. You do it, try it. But what's plan B? And then it would always be like, I don't want to do this, but I guess I'd have to be a welder or something like that. Something that they've been told is the real job thing. But if you ever picked anything in the middle, something that they might actually, when we would talk and get into it and like get into something they're actually into, like, I don't know, I'm gonna pull something completely out of my ass, but like one of them drew, like, let's say one of them drew comics. Be like, well, what about comics? Well, come on, that's not a real job. That's not, I'm not likely to succeed in that. And I'm like, less likely than to be in the NBA. You're 5'6". Like, and this is this thing that kind of comes from parents that, yeah. And I mean, and I'm a little bit running off topic here, but I mean, you're 100% right. And yeah, it's this kind of like a mash of problematic things that we put on kids.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like I was gonna say something and I have blanked because my wife started turning on the TV. So sorry about the editing thing that accidentally remote. Uh, okay, it doesn't look like it's actually gonna get cast too. That's good. Um, uh, sorry. Okay, let me focus up. The um, oh right, the thing that I was gonna say is um the interesting thing about the whole like plan B thing is like in the sports area in particular, there's this like weird counter narrative that's like being intentionally constructed. Like if you ever listen to like I hear this in like YouTuber circles as well, like people who have anyone who's in like a super highly competitive thing which has like incredibly high highs and incredibly low lows, right? There's this like thing of like people say to have a plan B, but like when you have a plan B, that means you got one foot out the door and you got to be committed and you got to like go all in on this thing and like this like weird fetishization of like just like completely throwing yourself at a thing.
You're in a cult now. You're not in a career,
Yeah.
you're in a cult.
And it's like, okay, look, I'm all for like giving it your shot or whatever and like going like 100% in or whatever, but like not with there's no safety net in society. So you got to prepare one for yourself because like the fundamental reality is like 99% of people that attempt this fail. So like you're going to die, like you're going to be homeless. It's going to be awful for you. Like you have to have a plan B, not because like it's not legit or not because you don't want to try your hardest, but like you got to have something to fall back on because society will kick you in the fucking teeth. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and I mean, this is, yeah, I believe this for any career because of, yeah, my personal lived life experience where I've personally watched people I grew up with fall through these cracks with things that seem like not that competitive of fields. Whatever you're trying to seek out, always have a plan B, maybe a plan C, maybe a plan D. Like, it is good to have contingencies, not in the idea, like, yeah, that whole construct of not having a contingency because you have to be a true believer is cult ideology. Yeah.
So this one like random aside, like sports being kind of like a weird exception to the central narrative of like how to succeed. It's society like centrally like being on the path, so to speak, like sports being this like weird thing that kind of like circles back in at some point. Like, you know, we have a lot of like the people that like go on this, right? And they've talked about their like benefits,
Mhm.
of 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 having like really well structured childhood and getting all this enrichment and whatnot. But like, what are the like similarly, we had people reporting all these great benefits of latchkey parenting, but the measured effects were less than stellar. I'm curious what the actual documented effects of helicopter parenting styles is.
Yeah, and so with this, because it is a very strong, regimented, very strict, you live the first 18 years of your life being told to do a thing and made to do a thing and forced to do a thing. One of the first and to me the biggest documented effects, because I think the most important thing to almost anything is efficacy, and that documented effect is the elastic response. So this is where you see college age teens who have been through this carefully curated childhood experience, very limited experience of freedom. They don't have any much they haven't had opportunities to be their own person. They'll respond elastically. They will bounce back and shut down when it comes to a lot of quote unquote productive endeavors. They'll shut down from those, and we see an increase in risk behaviors. We see an increase in behavioral issues. We see resistance to structure. And this is one of these things that, like, in psychology, in child and like adolescent psychology, we even see like this type of a parenting framework as like a risk factor, right? Or do you come from a really strict household where you were told what to do all of the time, which in this case is a polite way of doing that, right? Which is a thing to say about a lot of neoliberalism, is that it is authoritarianism, but not at the end of a switch or at the end of a ruler. It's, well, I really wanted you to be into X thing because you need to have you need to have all your time structured. I mean, this is something that I experienced in the classroom when I said, "Hey, kids don't operate this way." You would experience this where when you took away all of the kids on creative time, they were going to find that creative time in the day, and now it's just going to be during my you structured time, often during structured time that actually needs to exist, because no, we're in class right now, you need to stop, you know like swaddling your teddy bear, you need to focus on this class. Not having that outlet causes them to act out, and the longer they go without an outlet, the bigger some of that act out can be.
Some of that is like in a way more sinister than the explicitly authoritarian one. Like when an authoritarian, says like do this or I'll shoot you, right? Like that's like fairly straightforward. I mean, it sucks, but like there's no like it's fairly obvious. It's like I want to do a thing, this person's stopping me via a threat, and like the dynamic there is like very clean. Uh, if that I'm not sure if that's the right term for it, but it's like very well defined.
Mm-hmm.
It's not you don't go like there's no like internal conflict about whether or not like who's the bad guy. Whereas with this kind of thing, it's like significantly worse because like there's tons of justifying ideological like reasons behind a helicopter parent, like, oh, I'm just trying to make sure that you have a good life, I'm just trying to make sure that you like have a childhood where you got to try a bunch of stuff, and I'm just trying to make sure that like things don't go off the rails for you because like things can be really rough out there, and like there's all these kind of justifications that like uh on top of which like pushbacks against it are often seen as like are often like received instead of with like violence or punishment like in the traditional sense, like with like just like guilt or like things that like essentialize the problem back into them. So like there's this sense of like um so at the end of the day, if they go like and don't do the thing they're supposed to, it's like, oh, I'm bad, and
Yeah. Why aren't you
I
trying harder?
right, exactly. Like there's this kind of like essentializing the failure into the individual to avoid the criticism of the structure. Um, and um, I see it both at the, obviously like at the leftist level, you see that at the top level very obviously of like we talk about like panopticon or like any other kind of like stuff where they sort of like get the cop in your head, and make it so that like you don't do the thing you're not supposed to do because that would make you bad. And you do the same thing. The same helicopter parenting feels like it achieves the same sort of thing in that like it kind of tells you what to do, but instead of saying or else, it's saying it just says like it lets the consequences be passive instead of active, which is often like so much worse because passive violence, when there's an active violence against you, like with an authoritarian thing, it's like, okay, so if I really, really want to get out this, if I really can't stand it for 1 minute longer, you beat the shit out of the guy with the gun and take it from him. When you're in this kind of environment, it's so much more sinister because it's like, who do you beat up? Do you beat up your parent who's just trying to, give you a good life? Do you beat up the society that uh, how would you do that? Like beating up a society is the whole thing. Like that doesn't seem like an obvious thing to do at the individual level. And so it's like, um, you don't beat up your coach, like he's not part of the problem, he's just running a soccer team, or like there's no one to beat up. The violence is done by everyone a little bit all the time, and everyone has their justifications for their little piece of it. So like there's no one to beat up, and so there's no one to revolutionize against besides the very structure of the thing, which for that requires something that an individual never has access to on their own, like organization and collective action. But you're never going to get that as a child, like for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, and with all of that comes, of course, packaged in increased rates of anxiety and depression, right? Because you're going through all of that. Like it doesn't even take any answering. Like, and this is something that we see in both of these. We see increased rates of anxiety and depression, both in kids who feel lonely and alone and neglected in a latchkey parenting situation, and in parents, and in this situation where it's overbearing and no room for freedom and no, like all of this kind of like that. Like you're being oppressed, but you can't even really point at the oppression, or you're being sometimes gaslit out of recognizing that oppression. So yeah, you see increased rates of anxiety and depression. And another big one of this, one of the things I want to end on the negative effects here, because I think it's a very big one and an important one, because we often think of, pretty easily with latchkey parenting, okay, well, you're putting your kids around a bunch of strangers or by themselves. It's one or the other. It's either babysitters who you don't know that well, who aren't well vetted, or it's just a bunch of kids hanging out by themselves. And that's a risk environment for predation and abuse. But also in this situation, it is a risk environment for predation and abuse. This is something that I personally, in friends and acquaintances of mine who have went through this type of childhood, I run into this being a thing in their past very, very common, where they went through a bajillion tutors, coaches, people who were out not in school, but people who, because their entire life was structured, it was always spent around these auxiliary people outside of their parents who were guiding them through this thing. And by having a parade of older adults and older people around them, it left them more vulnerable to predation and sexual assault. So, with both of these, we see this higher risk of that for different reasons. Now, the actual horseshoe theory of this. We are running out of time. I think we might make that a third episode where we just discuss political horseshoe theory and we kind of
Yeah,
wrap all of this into
I
that.
think that makes sense. I
um,
will say that I find it interesting, real quick, that similarly to, you know, we we have like the documented effects and the negative effects. I feel like at the society level we see that as well. Like you know there's the sort of pointing at like just general like well-regulated capitalism. Look, it gives us the iPhone or whatever is like often touted as whatever, which there's plenty of legitimate criticism of that about how much of that was publicly funded. I won't go into it right now. Suffice it to say, iPhone not as good of an example for capitalism as they think it is, but like the idea being like, this, it really reminds me at the societal level of the kind of discourse around the 80s, like the end of history type of thing. Like communism's failed and feudalism's failed and every, coherent society has failed except for capitalist ones. And capitalism is the society. It's the one that works and it works the best and there's no better. And it's just a matter of tweaking the things to get perfection. And it promises this sort of like as close to utopia as it can possibly get. Um, but in reality, the touted positive effects of capitalism, some of which exist to some degree. Um, I certainly would take capitalism over feudalism, broadly speaking.
yeah.
Uh, the We still see a lot of problems that are often washed away and re-essentialized into the people experiencing them. Like, you know, uh, I think your point about the elastic response of kids who go off to college and like rebel, right, maps pretty well onto um, the rise of fascism that we have been seeing a lot in the year of our Lord 2022, particularly in Europe and in America. Um, and there's this sense very much of like people who reach the age of being able to be adults and be free, but having been constrained so hard by the system that they exist in and yearning for freedom reach out for the first thing that strikes them as revolutionary or pushing back on that. And unfortunately, the reality is that the right wing is generally a lot better at grabbing those people because, frankly, their narrative is a lot easier to comprehend. It doesn't require like a systemic analysis type of thing. Although I think that we could do better on the left about like communicating that to those people. But there's just this sense like Bobby Fischer, for example, was the famous chess player, is sort of slightly infamous for also being like kind of like a radical right winger. Uh, and the thing is, like, I kind of get it. Um, Only from the following perspective. If you grew up in a neoliberal society and the thing that you always hear is that society is great and it's just a matter of like doing the tweaking here or there thing, that narrative, the end of history narrative, right? If the one thing that you know from your personal experience is that you're being fucked over, and both political parties get up on stage and are saying like you're not being fucked over, it's just like we haven't gotten quite the right tax policy yet, then you're going to go, well, both of that's horseshit. And the first person, and then when Donald Trump like comes along, right, someone like that, and he says, oh no, you're being fucked and it's because of the Mexicans coming in here, like, that you've been lied to by the other two parties for lying, and this guy's at least not telling you that you're insane, and you're like, absent some better analysis, you're going to go, I mean, I guess that's probably it. Maybe it is the Mexicans, even if you're not a racist, right? And by that I mean like not a racist in like I hate Mexican people in that sort of like explicit racism way.
Yeah, in the
And
simple way of, oh, that's an outside group. Well, they're not my inside group, so yes, this is easy to process.
right, exactly. And so like I think the inherent problem is here is that like that sort of like tightly gripped helicopter parent sort of like at the societal level with neoliberalism has this effect of, in the same way that a kid goes off to college and rebels and goes and parties and drinks and whatnot, uh, and doesn't do their homework and goes wild. I think like a lot of people go off to adulthood in neoliberal society and say like, well, this is all wrong. I'm not going to do any of that shit. Maybe this guy with a manifesto who did a shooting is right. Like, and that's obviously horrible. And I think there's a legit narrative to tell those people, actually, it is broken in some way, and it's broken this way, but in a way that isn't horrible and murderous. But like, it's um, not going to be solved by more neoliberalism or more helicopter parenting, right?
No. Man, somebody should make a podcast about that, about like trying to redirect men and masculine people from, yeah, like a molding masculine. I don't know. We'll come up with it later.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. We'll think about
but
it.
where can people find this podcast?
You can find this podcast on anywhere that podcasts are typically streamed or found. Um, you can, if you want to see our lovely faces, you can do so on YouTube. And uh, if you are watching on YouTube, I'll do the generic like and subscribe bit. Hit the notification bell if you don't want to miss. And I have tested this myself. I do get a notification every time one of these episodes comes up. I don't go watch it because it's weird for me to watch myself have a discussion I've already heard. But anyway, if you really like the podcast though, and you want to see us improve it, and you want to join a community where we can discuss things related to leftism and parenting, you can support us on patreon.com/raisinleft. We have tiers of all sizes. So check us out there if you want to support us financially.
Yeah. Thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful morning, a